It began as a seemingly ordinary political roundtable hosted by a major streaming platform, meant to offer diverse perspectives on leadership and the upcoming election. The producers believed that placing Candace Owens and Kamala Harris on the same panel would spark compelling conversation. What they did not anticipate was the raw and unfiltered storm that would unfold the moment the two women locked eyes across the studio floor. From the outset, tension settled thick in the air. Candace sat with a composed demeanor, scanning the set with sharp precision, already suspecting the evening would veer off script. Kamala, in contrast, entered with a sense of authority, her posture tight and her eyes calculating. There was no handshake, no smile, no illusion of mutual respect. They both knew what they were there for, and neither was interested in playing polite. The topic introduced by the host was vague enough to provoke leadership qualities in times of cultural division. It was a question ripe for interpretation, and it took less than a minute before Candace made it personal. With surgical precision, she challenged the authenticity of Kamala's rise, suggesting it was built more on image than merit, and claiming that Harris had a track record of bending her beliefs depending on who was watching. Kamala's smile faded quickly, and she fired back with a tone that dripped with condescension. She didn't just disagree with Candace, she dismissed her entirely. What followed was no longer political commentary. It became a verbal war between two women who viewed each other not as opponents, but as symbols of everything wrong with the other's vision for the country. Candace leaned forward, unrelenting, striking at Harris's policies with brutal clarity, calling them reckless, detached from reality, and dangerous for working families. She accused Kamala of being a hollow icon, propped up by media illusion and corporate interests. The heat of her words was matched only by her refusal to back down, even as the moderators squirmed and other guests stared in disbelief. Kamala didn't flinch, but her anger was no longer simmering beneath the surface. It erupted. She countered by attacking Candace's character, claiming her positions were not just contrarian, but opportunistic, designed to exploit division rather than solve it. She painted Candace as someone who thrived on chaos, someone who spoke to inflame, not to inform. The exchange spiraled into outright hostility. Neither of them paused to breathe. There were no attempts to regain civility. The room became a battlefield, with the host powerless to mediate, and the cameras capturing every moment. What started as political critique had become a direct assault on each other's core values, their histories, their legitimacy. Viewers across the country were glued to the live broadcast, shocked at the ferocity of the confrontation. Social media lit up instantly. Clips of the argument were shared with disbelief, rage, and exhilaration. But behind the spectacle was something deeper, a real, raw conflict between two visions of leadership, of progress, and of what America should be. The conversation continued to intensify, and the audience sensed it was no longer about the debate. It was about dominance. One of them would walk away with the upper hand, and neither was willing to yield a single inch. Just as Candace threw down a particularly scathing critique that made even the moderator wince, Kamala's posture shifted. She wasn't just angry. Now, she was preparing to strike back on a level that could change the entire tone of the confrontation. Kamala leaned in, her expression sharpened with intensity, no longer speaking from the script of political poise, but from something far more personal. She reached back into Candace's past, dragging out moments meant to wound, not to inform. The confrontation had crossed the threshold of policy and professionalism. Now it was about character, legacy, and pride. She accused Candace of betrayal, of pandering to audiences that applauded division for profit, of stepping on her own community to reach prominence. There was a venom in her words that startled even the production crew. It was no longer a televised disagreement. It felt like a private war had suddenly gone public, a grudge match under blinding lights and rolling cameras. But Candace didn't blink. If anything, She welcomed the escalation. She stood from her seat slightly, ignoring the host's quiet plea for calm. Her voice carried across the room like a knife slicing through silence. She laid bare Kamala's contradictions, her career, decisions, her courtroom record, and her public shifts in tone depending on which crowd she stood before. She didn't hesitate to call it hypocrisy, dressed up in rhetoric. Kamala rose to match her. The two women now stood face to face, the table between them doing little to keep the exchange contained. Candace's words had begun to sting in a way Kamala hadn't anticipated. For years she had brushed off criticism as noise, but this wasn't noise. This was targeted, researched, and relentless. Candace wasn't just disagreeing. She was dismantling. The studio felt the weight of what was unfolding. Producers gestured frantically from behind the cameras, but no one dared step in. The power struggle was palpable, and neither woman was willing to surrender. They weren't just defending ideologies anymore. They were defending themselves, their credibility, their work, their place in history. Candace pushed the narrative forward, accusing Kamala of being the kind of leader who promised hope and delivered confusion, who stood for everyone but prioritized no one. She called out the policies that she claimed left communities abandoned and made the country weaker, not stronger. Her words were sharp, calculated, and unapologetic. Kamala, now visibly rattled, took a deep breath, then launched into a defense that turned into an offense. She attacked Candace's supporters, calling them blind to the damage she caused. She portrayed Candace as a provocateur with no responsibility for the consequences of her influence. She framed her as a performer, not a thinker. The audience was silent, holding their breath with each volley. The moderators gave up control entirely. The show was no longer about current events. It had become a national reckoning. Two powerful women, completely unfiltered, tearing down the facades of diplomacy. But then Candace made a move that shifted the entire dynamic. She pivoted from personal attacks and began addressing the crowd, not the panel. She laid out her vision for the country, a future she claimed Kamala would ruin. She didn't shout. She didn't rage. She presented it with an icy, measured conviction that cut even deeper than insults. Her message wasn't just about politics. It was about principles. She warned that under Kamala's leadership, the country would slip further into confusion, into instability, into a future shaped by indecision and media manipulation. Her words struck a chord that Kamala had not expected. Candace was no longer just criticizing. She was offering an alternative. Kamala attempted to reassert control, to draw attention back to Candace's controversial history, but the shift had already begun. The crowd in the studio, once unsure of how to react, started murmuring. There was a momentum behind Candace now, not because she was louder, but because she had landed a blow that Kamala hadn't anticipated, a vision that resonated, even if delivered through fury. And as Candace took her seat once more, her eyes locked on Kamala's, unwavering and cold. It was clear the next move would either make or break what remained of Kamala's standing in that room. Kamala remained standing, but her posture had shifted from assertive to defensive. The tide had turned so subtly yet forcefully that even she seemed to realize she was no longer steering the narrative. Her eyes scanned the room, then returned to Candace. But her gaze no longer carried the same fire. What had begun as an opportunity to publicly silence her most vocal critic was now slipping into something darker, something dangerously close to defeat. Candace sat calmly, her hands folded in front of her, as if daring Kamala to strike again. The composure was unnerving. She had gone from incendiary to icy, and the control it gave her over the room was undeniable. The audience had shifted in tone, not cheering, not booing, but riveted in quiet awe. Kamala's voice broke the silence, but it lacked the sharpness it carried earlier. She launched into a justification of her record, highlighting initiatives, progress, and moments of strength. But now the words felt like a retreat, not a rally. She began reciting numbers, programs, and carefully rehearsed talking points. Candace didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Every second Kamala spent defending herself was a moment the audience could sense her slipping. Then Candace slowly stood again, the silence amplifying each motion. She did not attack. She dissected. She walked through each of Kamala's talking points, countering them one by one with brutal efficiency. She brought up forgotten details, obscure policy reversals, and moments when Kamala's voice had vanished in moments of national crisis. The facts came like a sledgehammer masked as a scalpel. Candace pointed to moments when Kamala could have stood up for real reform, but instead stood back. She recalled statements made during her campaign that never saw follow-through, promises that vanished once power was achieved. There was no shouting, no dramatics, just a relentless stream of precision that made even Kamala's strongest allies on the panel hesitate before defending her. Kamala tried to interrupt, but the host intervened briefly, reminding her that Candace had the floor. It was the only time all night the moderator managed to regain control, and even that moment felt like an act of mercy. The studio had become uncomfortably still, the kind of stillness that comes before something finally cracks. And then it happened. Kamala snapped, raising her voice to full volume, no longer trying to convince, but to overpower. She accused Candace of being dangerous, of stirring up hatred under the illusion of patriotism. She called her reckless, a chaos agent masquerading as a reformer. Her tone was harsh, desperate, and tinged with personal hurt. But the outburst backfired. Instead of silencing Candace, it confirmed everything she had been building toward: the restraint, the measured precision, the cold certainty. It all now stood in contrast to Kamala's unraveling. The audience saw it. The panelists saw it. And Kamala saw it. Candace didn't raise her voice in response. She didn't need to. Her final words in that moment were slow and deliberate, spoken not just to Kamala, but to every viewer watching across the country. She painted a picture not of herself as a victor, but of Kamala as a symbol of everything the current political machine had become: reactive, disconnected, desperate to hold on to power even when the people no longer felt heard. And in that moment, the room turned. There were no standing ovations, no clapping, just a collective realization that something irreversible had happened. The confrontation wasn't just a heated exchange. It had shifted public perception. Candace had not just pushed back. She had dismantled an entire narrative in real time, in front of millions. Kamala sat down slowly, eyes distant, lips pressed tightly together. She wasn't defeated in words, she was defeated in silence. The moment Kamala sank back into her seat, the energy in the room shifted in a way no one could deny. The tension hadn't vanished, but it had evolved. What had started as a battle between equals now felt like the aftermath of a political demolition. Even the panelists who had been eager to jump in earlier found themselves retreating, unsure of how to salvage the conversation without acknowledging the devastation that had just taken place. The moderator, visibly shaken, attempted to pivot the discussion toward another guest, hoping to restore some semblance of balance. But it was too late. The story had already been written, and everyone in the studio knew who had seized control of it. Candace remained quiet, her expression unchanged, but her presence now towered over the entire production. She had not only outlasted the attack, she had redefined the terms of the argument. Across social media, clips from the confrontation exploded in reach. Candace's words were replayed, analyzed, quoted. Commentators on both sides of the political spectrum couldn't ignore what had unfolded. It wasn't just that she had stood her ground. It was the precision of her dismantling, the clarity of her critique, and the way she turned Kamala's accusations into tools for her own momentum. Kamala, meanwhile, faced an uncomfortable reckoning. Her outburst had damaged her carefully managed image. What was intended to be a display of strength had come off as emotional volatility under pressure. The moments when she raised her voice and lost the audience became snapshots of a leader rattled, not by misinformation or personal attacks, but by the hard truth of public scrutiny. After the broadcast ended, the behind-the-scenes atmosphere remained icy. Kamala left the studio quickly, surrounded by aides, avoiding the press, her face unreadable. Candace stayed behind briefly, interacting calmly with staff, her poise unshaken. Even those who disagreed with her ideology couldn't deny she had owned the moment with force. The network scrambled to get ahead of the story, releasing carefully worded statements insisting the confrontation was a natural byproduct of spirited debate. But the reality was far more raw. The clash had exposed not just political differences, but personal vulnerabilities, and it had done so in front of a live audience who would not forget what they saw. In the days that followed, the narrative crystallized. Candace had not simply slammed Kamala. She had overpowered her. With brutal clarity and unwavering composure, she had forced a reckoning that went far beyond two public figures sparring on a stage. It became a symbol of a growing shift in public discourse, a moment where polished talking points crumbled under the weight of raw, unapologetic confrontation. Supporters hailed Candace as fearless, a truth-teller who refused to be intimidated by legacy or status. Critics, though reluctant to admit it, acknowledged her dominance in that setting. The contrast between her composure and Kamala's unraveling became the story. And despite attempts to spin it differently, the footage was irrefutable. Kamala's team attempted to recover, releasing follow-up statements, organizing interviews, and framing the event as an ambush. But each move seemed hollow in light of what had transpired. Candace, by contrast, made no grand victory lap. She didn't need to. Her silence in the days after only amplified her impact. Weeks later, when another major event brought political figures back into the spotlight, Candace appeared again. And this time, her presence was different. She wasn't introduced as a controversial figure or even a pundit. She was introduced as the woman who had changed the conversation. The one who had gone toe-to-toe with a vice president and emerged untouchable. As the spotlight returned, Candace stepped forward once more, calm and ready, not to relive the moment, but to build on it. And across the country, viewers who had once tuned in out of curiosity now watched with something else: respect. The showdown with Kamala was over. The dust had settled, and in the end, it wasn't about who shouted the loudest, who had the most applause, or who held the highest title. It was about who stood unshaken when everything else began to fall apart. Candace had done just that, and America had watched every second of it.